Well, there are related knowledge effects to the illusion of explanatory depth that we could also discuss briefly to give a sense of its breadth. One is the illusion of argument justification, another is illusions of insight. The illusion of argument justification asks whether illusion of explanatory depth effects occur for guesses of how well we can justify arguments. So if I asked you how well can you argue for global warming or for various other genetically modified food effects, you might have strong views about how well you can do that. And I can also ask whether caring about the issue mitigates or aggravates your estimates of how well you can make the argument. You might think, in fact you might hope, that the more one cares about an issue, the more one knows about it and is well calibrated to one levels of understanding because one studied it and thought about it in depth and one's therefore better calibrated. So here's the kind of task we've done. We would ask someone, do you think global warming is caused by humans? And people would answer yes or no. And they'd say, okay, well, how well do you think you understand the argument for your side? So we'd say, rated on a scale, something like the scale we had before for the crossbow, 7 versus 1 versus 4, whatever. Then we'd ask them, how strongly do you feel about this issue? Do you feel very strongly about it or don't you really care at all? Great. So you've given a time 1 rating in essence. You've rated how strongly you feel about it. Now we ask you to write out your argument. Write out the argument, and then having written out the argument for or against global warming, for example, re-rate your level of understanding. What you find is something rather surprising. The way to look at this graph is that the upper line is the time 1 rating, and the lower line is the time 2 rating on a scale of 1 to 7. And the x-axis is how much they care about the issue. The first thing to notice is that the time 1 ratings, the average time 1 ratings, statistically average across all those dots, are higher than the time 2 ratings. So we have the illusion of argument justification. People think they can justify the argument better than they can, as shown by their subsequent time 2 rating. But you also notice that there's a bias that the more one cares, the higher one rates one's knowledge. So the more one cares about an issue, the more one rates one's level of understanding. You might think that's because they really do understand it better, but it doesn't seem to be the case, because we had third parties rate it, and that's this red line on the bottom. We see that the actual quality of the arguments is rated by third parties that these people made is essentially the same across all levels of care. So now we see something rather discouraging, that the more one cares about an issue, the more the illusion that one really knows about it, and the less one actually knows. So the disconnect, the level of arrogance, is stronger the more one cares about an issue rather than less. The illusion of argument justification, therefore, is propelled by many of the same biases as the illusion of explanatory depth, but it's further enhanced by emotional investment, which aggravates it. More generally, in other lines of work, we've shown that an argue-to-win mindset may induce more confidence about the objectivity of an issue than an arguing-to-learn mindset. It may make you see things as being more black and white and objectively true, and that can lead also to potentially a form of arrogance. Now, another way that one can have arrogance arises from what we call illusions of insight. And these are propelled in many cases by what we call a reductionist bias. This is the feeling or intuition that some kinds of evidence are more high quality than others, in particular, things that are closer to the physical and biological sciences. So there is a bias that we found in independent research to see physical and biological explanations as intrinsically more complex or meaty than, say, those at the psychological level or the economics level, even when there's actually no strong evidence to support that claim. And we find an effect of a rush of insight, a false rush of insight, occurring in a particular task involving cognitive psychology versus cognitive neuroscience. In essence, what we did is we described a study, and then we gave an explanation for the results of the study, and we either had no neuropsychology data relevant, or we had some neuropsychology phrasing that didn't actually give you any insight, but gave this sense of insight. So the reductionist bias, and also perhaps knowledge misattribution, thinking one knows one thing when one knows another, might drive the effect here. How do we test this? Well, we described a study on the curse of knowledge. And the curse of knowledge is essentially the effect that if you take bits of information that everyone knows at roughly 50%, and then you ask people how likely that other people know this, if they happen to know the knowledge themselves, they'll think other people know it as well. So for example, suppose you know the capital of Connecticut is Hartford, and you ask, how well do you think other people know the capital of Connecticut is Hartford? People might estimate that at 80% because they know the capital and they let their own knowledge leak into attributions about someone else's knowledge, when in fact it's actually closer to 50%. This is called the curse of knowledge. So that's the basic effect. And that's the study we described. We did several studies like this for our participants. We then offered explanations, but the explanations were carefully contrived. They were good explanations, which actually gave additional reasons for the effect and gave you some insight, versus bad explanations, which were circular, empty, and just rephrased the phenomenon. A good explanation of the curse of knowledge is the following. The researcher claims that this curse happens because subjects have trouble switching their point of view to consider what someone else might know, mistakenly projecting their own knowledge onto others. A bad explanation is this researcher claims that the curse happens because subjects make more mistakes when they have to judge knowledge of others. People are much better at judging what they themselves know. That second example basically restates the phenomenon. It doesn't give any kind of reason. So it's an inferior explanation. It's not as good. Now, in the with neuroscience cases, at the bottom panel, it's essentially the same thing, but we add in boldface information about brain scans and a particular brain region of frontal lobe circuitry. But if you watch carefully, this is not actually adding any real insight into what happened. It's just adding superfluous, uninformative neuroscience information. So, for example, it says brain scans indicate that this curse happens because of the frontal lobe brain circuitry known to be involved in self-knowledge. Subjects have trouble switching their point of view to consider what someone else might know, mistakenly projecting their own knowledge onto others. Notice again that this brain scan addition doesn't really, this brain neuroscience information doesn't really add anything to the explanation. It's just kind of neurofill. So having given good explanations and bad explanations with neuroscience, irrelevant neuroscience phrasing, or no neuroscience accompanying it, we find there's quite a strong difference. When it's a psychological explanation that's circular or empty, and there's no neuroscience accompanying it, people are, in the left-hand panel, very easily able to discount it as a bad explanation. And so they rate it much lower than the good explanation. However, when you give the same explanation and you add neuroscience information, which is actually irrelevant to the explanation, gives no additional real value, it nonetheless gives this rush of insight. They're feeling, oh, it's grounded in the brain, therefore I understand how it works. And so people have this kind of intellectual arrogance in terms of this illusion of insight. That's a really good explanation. And that's the right-hand panel, where you'll notice that the negative depression of the bad explanation is largely alleviated.